Bruno of Cologne is best known as the founder of the Carthusian Order. Today, we'll explore the remarkable life of Bruno, who established an order of peace and solitude amidst the chaos of the Christian world. As a distinguished teacher and head of a prestigious school, Bruno educated many prominent bishops, including one who would become pope. However, when he transitioned from academia to church administration, he found himself entangled in the Investiture Controversy, a fierce conflict between popes and kings. This turmoil drove Bruno to retreat from society not once, but twice, seeking solace in seclusion. In an era when Christian leaders and political officials clashed over what the church's influence should be in the world, Bruno chose to reject society and dedicate his life to solitary worship. Join us as we journey through Bruno's transformation from leading a top educational institution to living in the remote Chartreuse mountains, going back into the heart of society by serving as a trusted advisor to the Pope in Rome, and finally, leaving again to find solitude in southern Italy. Bruno was born around 1030 in Cologne in the area known as Germany. His family is historically credited as the Hartenfaust, a family with significant standing in the region at the time. Because of this, he grew up in one of the principal families of the cities and would have received a very good early education in the city. With his education from a young age, he would be given the opportunities to take his educational pursuits to the next level. He would travel around 230 miles or 370 kilometers to the city of Reims to study at the illustrious cathedral school in the area. He was trained in both secular and sacred realms, gaining knowledge of theological doctrines and philosophical teachings. After he had completed his education, he returned to his hometown in Cologne. At some point after he was back, sometime around 1055, he was ordained as a priest. In 1056, Archbishop Gervase of Reims called Bruno back to be a teacher at the school of Reims, where he was once a student. Soon after, he quickly made a name for himself and was asked to become the headmaster. Bruno would serve as the leader of the school from 1057 to 1075. Bruno became known for his immense knowledge, pedagogical qualities, and affection for the students under his care. Over the time, Bruno formulated various positive relationships with his pupils and the Catholic leadership around him. Because of this leadership, he was asked to leave his role in the schools and transition to ecclesiastical leadership. In 1075, he was appointed Chancellor of the Archdiocese of Reims. This new position meant he would take on the task of record-keeping official archives and was a notary for certifying documents. In general, he managed the administrative offices of the archdiocese. In the background of this transition for Bruno was the transition from the beloved Bishop Gervase de Château de Loire to the much-contested Manasses de Gournay. Gervase had been a good friend of Bruno and was the one who called Bruno to be the head of the school. Manasses, on the other hand, did not share the same religious vigor as the previous leadership. During this time, there was a situation going on between the secular world and the religious world over who had the authority to appoint leadership to ecclesiastical positions. This debate was referred to as the Investiture Controversy, occurring between Pope Gregory VII and Henry IV at the time. Bruno's real introduction to this debate actually came with the appointment of Manasses, who had been appointed not by the Pope, but by King Henry IV. This appointment highlights the Church's belief that the problem with the government was that they had often elected people to important positions based upon things other than theological matters. These positions quickly became political, and individuals who were not qualified spiritually or academically were given these positions so that they could be in the pockets of governmental leaders. Manasses seems to have been such an individual. Contemporary records speak negatively about his election. They critiqued his ability to perform the Mass properly, his bad temper, seemingly open corruption, and his simple lack of care for the ecclesiastical position. Bruno clashed with Manasses at several levels, but it would be a disagreement with the installing of a new abbot that would cause Manasses to defend himself to the Pope. Manasses would side with Henry IV and seek his protection against Pope Gregory VII. However, as it played out, Henry IV backed down, and Pope Gregory VII was able to keep the right of the church to elect bishops and abbots. Henry IV backing down also meant that Manasses was again on the hot seat. After he refused to appear at the Synod of Lyon, there was no coming back. On December 27, 1080, Pope Gregory VII deposed Manasses, stripping him of his title and effectively causing him to disappear from the historical record. With the new opening, many called for Bruno to replace Manasses, but he refused to do so. At this point, he seemed to have been soured on the administrative side of ecclesiastical work. Bruno had spent 18 years in educational administration and 6 years in ecclesiastical administration. It seemed at this point in his career he was longing for a different path. And with the rejection of the bishop position, he went sort of the opposite way and began to think about a life of monastic living. He collected a couple of his close friends who shared the same sentiment about seeking to draw away from the city and pressures of their jobs. Bruno finally made the decision and officially left Reims in his ecclesiastical position as chancellor in order to pursue a different way of living and worshiping. They first ventured to the Molesme Abbey run by Robert de Molesme. Robert was renowned as a pious leader and had put together a group that had built a reputation as a sanctified place to worship. Bruno came to Robert early on in his attempt at creating a group of followers. Nevertheless, he was able to learn from the wisdom and piety that Robert showed in an attempt to create a rule for his people to draw closer to God. Robert would go on to be one of the founders of the Cistercian Order, being second only to maybe the most famous Cistercian, Bernard of Clairvaux, whom we have covered on this channel before. You can learn more about him by clicking the link at the top of the screen. However, Bruno would not stay with Robert de Molesme and his group long. Taking the wisdom that St. Robert would be able to impart to them, they began searching for a place where they would make their own organization. In 1084, 2 years after arriving at Molesme Abbey, Bruno and 6 of his friends set out on their next journey. In 1084, they met a man named Hugh of Grenoble. Hugh was the bishop of Grenoble and had made a name for himself in countering abuses in his diocese and helping to foster devotion and faith. But Hugh's acceptance of Bruno went beyond his compassion for those seeking a deeper faith. The legend goes that Hugh had received a vision in which 7 stars showed the way to the desert, where a house was built for the glory of God. When Bruno and his 6 friends came to Hugh, he recognized this as his vision coming true and welcomed the group with open arms. The first 6 official companions joining Bruno, Landuin, Stephen of Bourg, Stephen of Die, Hugh the chaplain, and 2 lay brothers, Andrew and Guerin. Hugh of Grenoble favored Bruno and his group, maybe because Hugh was a student of Bruno while in Reims, but we're not certain. Either way, Hugh helped set up the small group by installing the 7 in a snowy, rocky, alpine location called Chartreuse. This place would be where Bruno and the group began to build their houses and places of worship. Bruno headed the project to build a community in the snowy Alps. They began to build small cells within a short distance from each other. However, overall, they were isolated in the wilderness. Bruno attempted to try and recapture the original feeling of monasticism, focusing on a deep passion to draw near to God, to live in true poverty, relying on either what their own hand could toil or the kindness of strangers, and a deep devotion to the idea of solitude. Although none of these ideas would be written down in any defined rule or procedures, they would be the foundation for the group of Chartreuse going forward. The community would grow and draw more attention to itself for the next 6 years. Hugh of Grenoble, who would become known as St. Hugh, would be a frequent visitor to the group and spent a good amount of time with the group over these years. Besides Hugh, the group began to be known and recognized for their devotion to learning and cultivating solitude and prayer. In these 6 years, a lot was happening behind the scenes in both the political and religious landscape. In this video, we will not go into much detail about the behind the scenes. However, I want to return to the disagreement between King Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII. The Investiture Controversy had begun to escalate between the king and the pope. We mentioned this earlier when talking about the bishop Manasses. At this time, it seemed things had been settled, and this is why Pope Gregory VII officially released Manasses from his position. However, although Bruno had decided to move away from these issues to draw closer to God, another significant turn of events would bring Bruno right back into the fold. On May 25, 1085, Pope Gregory VII passed away and left the position as Pope vacant. One of the three men he listed that he would like to replace him upon his death was Otto of Chatillon. Otto was a very influential bishop in the Catholic Church, having been the Grand Priory of Cluny and later named Cardinal Bishop of Ostia, a very prominent position in Rome. Unfortunately, Otto would not get the immediate call to be pope. Instead, Desiderius, the abbot of Monte Cassino, would be elected to take the position. However, for the next 3 years, with a combination of Desiderius' rejection of the papacy, the inability to spend time in Rome, and a general lack of leadership, Desiderius, who had become Pope Victor III, died in September of 1087. At this point, it seemed to be an obvious choice for Otto to be put in charge, and in March 1088, Otto of Chatillon officially became Pope Urban II. The reason any of this is relevant to Bruno's life is that Otto just so happened to be a prominent student of Bruno while he was teaching at Reims. Otto always held Bruno at a high level, and when he finally got the call to be Pope, he felt it necessary for Bruno to be a part of his leadership and requested Bruno stay with him and be a trusted advisor. Urban II was facing a large fight with King Henry IV, as well as a growing threat to the Christians' access to the Holy Land, with a new Sunni Muslim empire that was beginning to restrict access to Christian pilgrimage. Going back to the Henry IV issue, the major problem Urban II had was with Henry's new mindset about electing his own religious leaders. Although Henry IV partook in the walk to Canossa, the famous story about Henry seeking penance from Pope Gregory to be let back into the fold, this was not the actual end. They continued to argue with each other, and eventually, Henry took Rome and installed a new pope in Gregory's place. The Bishop of Ravenna, Gilbert, had been selected by Henry to be Pope Clement III. Of course, there was already a pope at the time. So many on the opposite side of Henry took to calling Gilbert anti-pope in reference to his illegitimate placement from the king. With all these problems occurring immediately upon Urban's appointment, Bruno started to think that it would be worthwhile giving up his solitude to enter into the administrative side of the religious order. In 1090, after being pope for 2 years, Bruno officially made his way to Rome to join Urban's advisory team. It cannot be understated how beneficial it would have been to have someone like Bruno helping Urban II work through some significant theological problems he would be addressing in his reign. Although Urban was highly brilliant, I can only imagine that having his knowledgeable teacher with him at this pivotal time in history made him that much happier. However, we do not get the picture that Bruno was really all in on this move. He had very publicly left the traditional leadership in the church because of the difficulties he faced fighting many of the same battles Urban II was at this time. Regardless of whether it was a pupil asking for help or the fact that it was the Pope himself, Bruno obeyed and agreed to leave the community he started in Chartreuse. This move initially did not go great for the community as they began to splinter, believing that the place would fall apart without Bruno. However, Bruno wrote them a letter reassuring that the practices that they had set in place were righteous and that they were fully capable of continuing what they started in those hills. One of his close friends who had taken the journey with him, Master Landwin, would officially become the second prior to Chartreuse after Bruno left. With Bruno officially arriving in Rome in 1090, he quickly became involved in the inner circle of Urban II. For Bruno, his time away had only made him more hesitant to engage with some of the problems Urban faced. There is hardly any documented evidence as to what exactly Bruno was doing to help Urban II. We know that he was required to be near him to offer support and guidance, but how much, how often, or the scope of that help is unknown. Unfortunately, most of what we do know is that it simply was not an excellent fit for Bruno. One scholar wrote, "The difficulties of diplomacy during this time, the war, the schism, the intrigue, this was a world in which Bruno could not fit. Could anyone who for 6 years had tested the peace of Chartreuse, the prayer, the friendship, the heavenly familiarity of the hermitage, have become accustomed to the commotion of the Roman court in exile during the autumn of 1090? The dichotomy of the two worlds simply left no room for Bruno to be the massive influence that Urban had hoped for. However, Urban sought to find a middle ground for Bruno. He wanted him to stay in administrative work and become the Archbishop of Reggio Calabria. Bruno stayed firm in his resolve and instead offered up a formal pupil, Tangerius, who was part of the order of Saint Benedict, to become Archbishop of Reggio Calabria. Ultimately, after a short time, Bruno and Urban agreed to part ways. In reality, Bruno likely had minimal impact on the later actions of Urban II. Although he helped push against King Henry and stood alongside Urban II in the Investiture Controversy, this was more of an example he set since he was in solitude when the real fighting between the Pope and King occurred. It is unlikely Bruno played a significant part in the Council of Clermont, where Urban made his famous speech that ignited the movement that would become the First Crusade. Overall, it seemed this time would be the final decision to turn entirely away from life outside of solitude. He once again threw himself completely into creating a new monastic holding that would embrace the solitude and contemplative life that seemed so opposite from the chaotic and reactionary experience he was having in Rome. Nevertheless, although Pope Urban II finally granted his wish to return to the wilderness, he would surprise many by not returning to his place at Chartreuse and embark on an entirely new adventure with a couple of his followers. He would make his way to the diocese of Squillace near the southern tip of Italy. He found his way to a forested valley and began setting up a new community. Bruno was lucky enough to have sparked up a friendship with Robert I, who was the Count of Sicily. Through this relationship, he was gifted a plot of land. In return, Bruno built a cabin for Roger so that he could visit anytime he wanted. To exemplify this relationship, in 1095, Bruno would baptize Roger's son, Roger II, who would go on to become the King of Sicily and would be given the moniker Roger the Great. However, for Bruno, he spent the next 10 years devoted to his silence and solitude. He would stay in communication with his previous community. However, at this point, he understood that they had begun to build up their own identity and would continue to prosper into an entire movement. In Squillace, Bruno lived out many of his years in his personal cabin dedicated to the principles he taught and lived throughout his life. Unfortunately, things began to take a turn for the worst starting in 1099. In 1099, Urban II passed away, giving way to Pascal II. The following year, in 1100, Landwin, one of the first 6 companions that had originally left with Bruno and was a part of the building up of the order at Chartreuse and a close friend, passed away. The following year after that, in 1101, Count Roger I, his patron, and another close friend passed away. After the passing of 3 of his dear friends in the last 3 years, he would unfortunately join them on October 6, 1101, when Bruno himself passed away. Bruno's passing spread quickly, and many came to mourn the loss of a great influential teacher. A custom at that time was to take around what is called a mortuary roll, which is similar to the modern-day custom of a funeral registry book where individuals could sign their name and leave a positive note about the deceased's life or impact. This roll would be presented not just in the local city, but all throughout Italy and several of the surrounding countries. There were eventually 178 witnesses that modern scholars have been able to distinguish on the paper that signed their name. It is one of the most well-preserved copies of a mortuary roll. It has been a very helpful piece of history that has helped stretch the legacy of Bruno of Cologne from 1101 AD to the present day. But it was not just the mortuary roll that would exemplify his impact on the people around him. From early on, great reverence was given to Bruno and his impact on the people around him. For many years, his followers did not seek to further his legacy of sainthood. A quote about the Carthusians is, quote, "The charter house makes saints, but does not make them known." This quote is at the heart of what is so beautiful about the order and practices that come from Bruno's leadership. In 1127, St Hugh of Grenoble drew up the Customs of Chartreuse, in which he wrote down the customs of the monastery and helped start the official spread and growth of the Carthusian Order. Hundreds of years would go by of faithful souls growing their relationship with God based upon Bruno's leadership. It was not until around 1514 that a formal movement would be made to try and officially promote Bruno of Cologne to sainthood. The General Chapter of the Order, 1514, under the direction of the Reverend Father General Domfraucois du Puy, officially decided it was time to submit Bruno for canonization. It could not have been a better time. The Carthusian Order was at its peak with 5,600 religious monks and nuns divided into 198 monasteries. Pope Leo X accepted the Carthusians' request, confirmed Bruno's merits, and by an act of equivalent canonization, which means a decree emanating from its own authority without going through the normal canonization process, on July 19, 1514, beatified Bruno and authorized the liturgical feast of Bruno of Cologne. Because of this, Bruno would become officially recognized by the entire church as Saint Bruno of Cologne in 1623 by Pope Gregory XV. Bruno's impact on his local community and the world through his help in founding the Carthusian Order cannot be overstated. His life and the movement were devoted to the search of God in the secret of the heart, but within a local community that have helped to shape thousands and thousands of men and women of faith throughout history. Although answering the call of the Carthusians means being completely separated from the rest of the world, the way in which the Carthusians devote their lives to worshiping God is an example to those outside of the order to follow. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, you might also like the video on the screen now, where we look at the life and works of another important leader of the church, Bernard of Clairvaux, a contemporary during the life of Bruno of Cologne.